To trade up or to trade down? That is the question that we're going to answer on today's Mock Draft Monday.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, and of course, your very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your own football franchise, this is the game definitely for you. So download the game by visiting ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. So, guys, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. So later in today's episode, we will be talking about the Bud Dupree signing with Tyler Rowland, the host of Locked On Titans, and he'll give us the lowdown on why Bud Dupree didn't work out in Tennessee and why he could work out here in Atlanta. But first, we got to get into some of these mock drafts and looking over many of the mock drafts. I've seen a couple that have the Falcons trading up, trading down over the last week. And let's talk a little bit about the possibility of the Falcons trading up. Right. And I look at a mock draft from Christian DeAndrea from For the Win, and he has the Falcons trading up in his mock draft to the number 5 overall selection with the Seattle Seahawks in order to select Will Anderson, the pass rusher out of Alabama. And the Falcons only have to give up a third-round pick, and that's a very small price to pay for who is the consensus number 1 overall player in this draft class in Anderson. And that seems like a home run based off of that logic, but I feel like that logic's a little flawed, guys, because I don't know if Anderson is the best player in this draft class. I think Jalen Carter is by far the best player in this draft class. I don't even know if Anderson's in the top 5 in terms of the best players in this draft class. And while I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it, I do want to explain my reasoning on that. And it has been interesting seeing people like Chris Sims and Alex Rollins and a handful of others people seemingly in recent weeks buck the sort of conventional wisdom that Will Anderson is a so-called elite prospect that he has been billed to be. And certainly I was one of the people pushing that narrative, certainly last summer, in terms of gassing up what Will Anderson could be in the NFL and potentially being the next Von Miller. But then we saw his 2022 season at Alabama, and despite the production, I don't think the film is as impressive as it, the stat sheets seem to suggest it is. And that prompted me to kind of go back and revisit his 2021 film. And I concluded that that wasn't nearly as impressive as I initially thought it was. And it's, to me, a classic case of confirmation bias, going and watching the film last year, last summer, 6 months ago, feeling like, oh, you expect Will Anderson to be this great player and you just see enough and you sort of automatically assume that. And the reason why I'm, questioning Will Anderson a little bit on today's episode, guys, is because in the 2022 film, a lot of his production was due to stunts. It was due to schemes. It was due to, him being unblocked, right? I posted a graphic on the Discord where I went back and charted several of his sacks, his tackles for loss, his quarterback hits. And 5 out of his 10 sacks this past year came as a result of him beating an offensive lineman with a pass rush move. The other 5 were basically cleanup sacks or stunts. And then you look at 40% of his tackles for loss that I charted were when he was unblocked, right? And then you look at, 30% of his quarterback hits only required him to beat a blocker, and the rest were, cleanup plays or him, beating a running back that whiffed on the block and things like that. And going back and watching the 2021 film, in addition to that, the pattern kind of matched with a lot of his production the previous year. Right. And when it comes to Will Anderson beating players that are going to be starting offensive linemen in the NFL, you're not going to find too many reps, or at least I didn't find too many reps of him beating those types of guys at the collegiate level. Right. You compare that to a player like Jalen Carter, where you can go and watch his performance against Florida going up against O'Cyrus Torrence, and he dominated Torrence in that game. I don't know if you can find too many games where Will Anderson dominated a future NFL player. You take, for instance, his performance against Tennessee this past year against Darnell Wright, where a lot of people are, big fans of Darnell Wright because they're like, oh, he shut down Will Anderson. And rather than that sort of being an outlier performance or a testament to Darnell Wright's ability, I think that's proof of what I'm talking about with Will Anderson, where like he's not beating NFL caliber offensive tackles. You go to the previous year against Tennessee where Darnell Wright was playing left tackle. He wasn't getting a lot of production against Darnell Wright in that game. A lot of that came against the right tackle in that game, who I believe was the backup right tackle for the Tennessee Volunteers. And that's kind of exemplary of Will Anderson's entire body of work. And so I could continue to go deeper on this. I'm not going to. I do think Will Anderson will be a good NFL player, but I don't know if he's going to live up to the sort of comp that you constantly hear like Von Miller or Khalil Mack and be that type of dominant presence in the NFL. I see him as more of having an NFL career, more like a Carl Lawson, a good player, a good productive pass rusher, but not going to be the truly dominant pass rusher that I think a lot of people have built him up to be. But I'm sure I will get a lot of pushback on this in the comments. So go ahead and roast me in the comments for having a slightly different opinion about a potential NFL player. So I do not expect the Falcons, despite my opinions on Will Anderson. I don't expect the Falcons to be that interested in Will Anderson, especially to trade up for him. I don't see the value of the Falcons adding another undersized pass rusher. I think if they're going to get an edge rusher at the top of this draft, it's going to be someone like Tyree Wilson of Texas Tech, Myles Murphy of Clemson. That seems to be more their type of fit. And I've seen a lot more mocks over the last week or two starting to put Myles Murphy back into the top 10. So that may be something to keep an eye on. But, why would you draft Will Anderson when you've just gone out and signed Bud Dupree? Now, we'll get to that later in the podcast and talk about his impact. But let's talk a little bit more about the potential trade back scenarios for the Atlanta Falcons, and we'll continue that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about the Ultimate Football GM, and today's episode is brought to you by this fun new mobile game. And if you're looking to make trades ahead of the draft or make signings ahead of your draft, if you want to be an NFL GM, this is the game definitely for you. You can control every strategic aspect of your team, whether it's signing players, making trades, drafting players, free agents, going through all the ups and downs of the season in a very challenging and very realistic game world. Yeah, I'm sure some of you guys that have downloaded the game already know what it's like to be in cap hell in that game, and it is very frustrating to try to navigate that through a season. So it is very challenging in those ways. So make sure you go check out this game by going to ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. And when you do, make sure you use our promo code Locked On in all caps, as LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store, and you'll get 100% free boost to your franchise. So again, head on over to ultimate-gm.com to download the game Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So guys, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Shout out to all my everydayers. And for the rest of you that aren't listening every single day, you got to step your game up, right? But let's talk a little bit about the Falcons trading back options. And I think this is always an option on the table for a lot of fans and certainly most NFL teams. But as we often say, you got to have two to tango. But I do feel like the trade back possibility seems to be increasing. And that is in part due to we don't quite know what's going to go on at the top of the draft. I think for a while, a lot of us, myself included, have kind of assumed that quarterbacks will go 1 and 2 in this draft. Ever since the Carolina Panthers traded up to that #1 overall spot, it will be them and Houston taking a quarterback back to back in this draft. It's going to be C.J. Stroud of Ohio State or Bryce Young out of Alabama in some order. And it seems like there's been a lot more buzz over the last couple of weeks that may not be the case. Carolina is going to take a quarterback at 1, but maybe Houston won't take a quarterback. It sounds like a lot of people seem to suggest that Houston really likes Bryce Young and they're not as high on CJ Stroud. So given the notion that Bryce Young is now the favorite to be the Carolina Panthers #1 overall pick, if they take him, do the Texans pass on CJ Stroud? Now, who knows if this is true? Who knows if some of this buzz is just kind of Carolina putting out the smoke to basically get Houston to trade up with them so they can get assets and still kind of get the quarterback who's either 1 or 1A on their draft board, or 1B, I guess, on their draft board, and CJ Stroud, if they move back one spot, who knows at this point? This is why I absolutely love the draft, guys, because we don't know what's going to happen 10 days from now on that Thursday night. And that's what makes the draft so exciting. It's like being a kid on Christmas. So we'll see how that goes. But this now applies to the Atlanta Falcons because all along myself, and I'm sure many of you out there have also kind of been assuming that we'll see multiple quarterbacks gone in the first 7 picks, at least 3, if not 4 quarterbacks in the top 7. And that means that the Falcons are pretty much guaranteed to get one of the top 5 non-quarterbacks available in this draft. And the consensus is Will Anderson, Jalen Carter of Georgia, Tyree Wilson of Texas Tech, Christian Gonzalez, a cornerback from Oregon, and Bijan Robinson, the running back from Texas, seem to be the consensus top 5 non-quarterbacks in this draft class. And if 3 quarterbacks go in the top 7, the Falcons are guaranteed to get at least one of those guys, and potentially 2 of those guys could be on the board if 4 quarterbacks go in the top 7. And, I've been of the mind that we will see quarterbacks go early in this draft, even if that is not a common occurrence. You go back to the 2021 draft where the expectation a lot of people had was we could see quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3, 4 in that draft class. And the reason why it didn't, we saw quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3. We saw the 4th quarterback in Justin Fields fall to the 11th overall selection, but to me it was justifiable because when you look at all the players that went ahead of Justin Fields from 4 through 10, you see a lot of premium talent at premium positions. You have Kyle Pitts, Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Penei Sewell, J.C. Horn, Patrick Surtain, Devontae Smith, and it doesn't seem like this year's draft class has that many of those guys that's going to really cause these quarterbacks to fall. You don't necessarily have an elite receiver that can match players like Chase, Waddle, and Smith. Maybe you might consider Christian Gonzalez or Devin Witherspoon, the corner from Illinois, on the same tier of J.C. Horn and Patrick Surtain, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people seem to be thinking that way. You don't have a Penei Sewell in this draft class, given that the top offensive tackle, Peter Skoronski out of Northwestern, a lot of people project to be a guard in the NFL. So it is a situation where it doesn't seem like teams are going to be passing on a quarterback for, a premium position at a premium player at another position at a premium position. So that's been leading that, but maybe that's not true. Maybe let's imagine a scenario where the Falcons or the rest of the NFL there's only 2 quarterbacks going in the top 7. And that does complicate things for the Falcons. The downside of that is that they may not be able to get one of those elite players, those premier players at a non-quarterback position at 8. But the upside of that is maybe it does open the door for them to trade back, right? And, I think the teams picking immediately ahead of the Falcons will probably benefit more from that scenario where we don't see the quarterbacks go early in this draft. Teams like Arizona, Seattle, Detroit that seemingly have their at least short-term answers at quarterback, moving back with teams like, the Raiders picking at 7, Tennessee picking at 11, Washington at 16, maybe Houston, if they pass on a quarterback at 2, maybe they use that 12th overall pick to go back up and get their guy, earlier in the draft. We'll see how that plays out, but let's look at a mock draft that recently had the Falcons trading back. CBS Sports' Chris Trapasso had a mock where the Washington Commanders moved up from 16 to 8 to get Anthony Richardson, the Florida quarterback, and the Falcons moved back to 16 to get Bijan Robinson. Now, Chris did not mention the terms of that trade in terms of what the Falcons would get back in that trade, but we've talked before on a recent Q&A where a listener asked sort of, how far would the Falcons have to move back in order to get a future first-round pick? And based off of past drafts, I basically said like 10 to 15 spots would probably certainly get the Falcons a future first-round pick. And so moving back 8 spots is getting close to that. You look at a previous trade where the Buffalo Bills in 2018 moved up from 12 to 7 to get Josh Allen. They gave up 2 seconds in order to secure that. So one would imagine going back from 8 to 16, you would get at least 2 seconds. So maybe like 2 seconds in a 3rd or 4th or something, or maybe potentially Washington would give a future first-round pick. And I think that would be an advantageous trade for the Falcons. Obviously, I think a lot of people, especially those Falcon fans that are a little bit lukewarm on the idea of potentially taking a running back at 8, would be much more open to moving back 8 spots, getting a player like Bijan Robinson, where the value seems to fit a little bit better, as well as picking up potential future assets in this year's draft and next year's draft. I really do think getting assets in next year's draft is valuable. Obviously, you want to get something this year in addition to that. But, instead of, I've seen so many mock drafts over the last couple of months where people have submitted to me on Twitter or in the Discord talking about how, making multiple trade backs and wind up picking like 12 or like 15 guys in this year's draft, and there's really just not 12 to 15 spots available on this roster right now. Frankly, the Falcons only, I think, have 80 guys on the roster, so there's only really 10 spots available on their roster. But, you know, reality, I think there's probably only 8 or maybe 9 spots that the Falcons could realistically draft that could realistically make the team, and maybe we'll discuss that on a future episode later this week as well, whether those spots moving forward. So I do think getting assets next year, it's advantageous. You get picks in 2024. Obviously, you know, the potential there, if the Falcons are not as sold on Desmond Ridder a year from now and want to move in another direction at the quarterback position, those assets would benefit them in a major way there. But in addition to that, and let me be clear, I don't think the Falcons are going to be moving off of Desmond Ridder a year from now. I don't think that's a very likely outcome, but we'll sort of have to see. But obviously, if you can put yourself in a position similar to what the Eagles did a year ago when they were in a similar boat with Jalen Hurts, you know, that would be advantageous. And you're seeing they're going to get 2 first-round picks this year. But, you know, I also sort of look at, you know, the fact that 12, depending on who you think is going to make the roster, between 12 and like 20 guys are currently under the contract for the Falcons are going to hit free agency. So you want to have assets that will allow you to replenish your roster. That would be extremely valuable a year from now, as well as the possibility of getting assets that can allow you to trade for veteran players. Let's imagine a world where Desmond Ridder, you know, does play well. And that's the world that I think a lot of us are, you know, constantly imagining as we lay our heads down to sleep each and every night. But Desmond Ridder plays well, but, you know, to get over the hump, you know, whether that's to make the playoffs or win a playoff game, a year from now, maybe you want to go out there and get a veteran player, and those assets that you acquire in this sort of trade back scenario would help you benefit to, you know, if you get a 2nd or 3rd round pick next year or something like that, that would allow you to be able to send that some way to get maybe that veteran player that's going to be that sort of quote unquote final piece to the puzzle. So all of these things to me make a ton of sense. It's something to keep our eyes on. You know, I do think we'll get at least 3 quarterbacks in the top 7, but I'm not as convinced as I was, you know, 2 weeks ago that those quarterbacks are definitely going to Carolina, Houston, and Indianapolis. So we'll just have to see how that all plays out. And we'll also have to see how Bud Dupree contributes to this team and impacts the Falcons draft plans. And we'll talk about that with Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans to wrap up today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned for that. All right, everyone, we are back with another illustrious guest. He is none other than Tyler Rowland, the host of the Locked On Titans podcast, and we've had him frequently on this show the last 2 off seasons because, as you guys can see over my shoulder, if you're watching on YouTube and making us your first watch, right, that Tennessee to Atlanta pipeline has been going strong these last 2 years, and it only continued with the acquisition of Bud Dupree, who spent the last couple of seasons with the Tennessee Titans. And Tyler's going to join us to give his thoughts on why things didn't quite work out for Bud Dupree in Tennessee. So, Tyler, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I love coming on here. I think at this point I may petition to Locked On and say that I'm a co-host of Locked On Falcons at this point. All jokes aside, like the move for Atlanta, so I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more. But Bud Dupree obviously didn't work out in Tennessee. We'll get into that as well. But I do like the move at first glance for the Falcons.
Yeah. Let's talk about why it didn't work out for Bud Dupree. They went out, you know, the last couple of off seasons, spent a lot of money on pass rushers, Jadeveon Clowney, Bud Dupree, keeping Harold Landry. I'm probably forgetting somebody else.
Vic Beasley.
There you go.
That was a disaster. He held out by training camp with a new deal.
You know, why didn't it work out for Bud Dupree?
I think that it's 2 different things. One is like a perception reason, and then one is an on-field reason. So number one, on-field, he just couldn't stay healthy. Came in off a torn ACL, which why are you giving a guy a 5-year, $85 million deal at the top of the market when there are guys like Trey Hendrickson and Hassan Reddick and Matthew Judon? Why are you paying Bud Dupree more than all those guys when he's coming off a torn ACL? He tried to come back too early, put the pressure on himself to play because he got the new big deal. He tried to play from week 1 off the ACL tear, and he re-injured his knee throughout the season, could not stay healthy at all. He ended up only playing in 11 games, and he left a lot of those games early, quite honestly. So saying that he played 11 out of 17 is a bit misleading as well because he would leave early in a lot of games. And then you go into season number 2 for Bud Dupree in Tennessee, and he said, I believe that he said that, it was a compensation issue, but he started having a hip issue last year, and he only played in 11 games again. And a lot of those games, he played the first quarter and then he left early. So he only played 22 out of a possible 34 games in 2 seasons. And that number is misleading because he left so many games early after he re-aggravated some injury that he had. That's the real on-field reason it didn't work out for Bud Dupree, but also the perception reason that I hinted at. You got 5 years, $85 million. And the guy who gave him that contract, Titans' former general manager, John Robinson. And we could talk about the A.J. Brown trade all we want, but a big reason why the Titans are in the cap situation that they're in is because he gave that deal to Bud Dupree. And a lot of people, I have been known as somewhat of a Bud Dupree hater in the Titans community, on Titans Twitter. Since the deal was signed for Bud Dupree, I said, he's going to be gone in 2 years. Once they get an out, they're going to get out from him, because to me, Bud Dupree is not a top-tier premier edge rusher. He's not your number one rush guy that you build everything around. Bud Dupree in Pittsburgh, in my opinion, was the 4th best rusher on the team. You had Watt, and then you had Hayward, and then Stephon Tuitt. So the way, if you go back and look at the tape of how Bud Dupree got his sacks in Pittsburgh, because that last year in Pittsburgh, Bud Dupree had 11 and a half sacks, or he had 8 sacks. He had 11 and a half the year before that. So he really had good sack production. But if you go back and look at that last year in Pittsburgh, those 8 sacks, they're like cleanup sacks. They're from relentless effort. They're not Bud Dupree winning with a move, getting to the quarterback. They're TJ Watt flushing a quarterback out, Cam Hayward flushing it, and Bud Dupree's just relentless and giving a ton of effort and finds a way to get to the quarterback. So I feel like some of his sack production in the past was more of a product of his environment. But if you look at the raw numbers and you look at the contract that the Titans gave him, Titans fans are like, oh, he's a top-tier edge rusher, top-tier pass rusher. He's just simply not. He was going to hit the Titans cap for $20 million in 2023. So that's why they ate $10 million in dead money to save $10 million in money, because Bud Dupree is simply not that guy. I still think, and I've said all along throughout the contract with the Titans, that Bud Dupree can still be like a starting level edge rusher, but he's not the top tier premium pass rusher that he was being paid to be. He was mistakenly paid to be in Tennessee. So that's why I say I like this move a lot for Atlanta, because at the price tag that Atlanta is paying for Bud Dupree, up to $5 million, which means what? $2 to $3 million in actuality, unless he hits those incentives. For that price, for a starting level edge rusher that will be physical and relentless and give effort, if he stays healthy, that's a really, really good deal. And if he doesn't stay healthy, you didn't sacrifice so much money that it's super punitive for the Falcons either way. So that's kind of what happened in Tennessee, my view on Bud Dupree, and why I like the move for the Falcons at that price point.
Well, Tyler, you said it all. I have similar sentiments from Bud Dupree from his time in Pittsburgh, watching him the last couple of years in Tennessee, and similar thoughts on him not being that type of guy that paid that type of money. And as you say, here in Atlanta, they're not paying him that premium. They're not expecting him to be the guy like I think Tennessee was hoping he would wind up being. And so it may wind up looking like a real big bargain for, a year or two from now, what the Falcons are paying for Bud Dupree and what they're going to get back from him compared to Tennessee. So I do think we can look and learn the lessons from the Tennessee Titans in terms of don't pay him a premium, may not necessarily expect him to play a full season, but if you're only paying $2 or $3 million for that type of guy, that's well worth, kicking the pants on, rather than, giving that guy kicking tires. Sorry.
Hey, he might be kicking pants out there too. Yeah. I'll tell you, one thing that Bud Dupree did do during his time in Tennessee is he freaking got in a fight with a Walgreens worker. I think it was the hardest hit that he gave while he was in Nashville. But all jokes aside, we talked about pass rush so much, but I did want to take a moment to mention that Bud Dupree is really good in run defense when he's healthy. I mean, he is violent. He will set the edge. Mike Vrabel has this phrase for run defense. It's edge, wall, swarm. And you got to set that hard edge, then create the wall, and then everyone swarm. And when Bud Dupree is healthy, he was a hotly debated guy in Tennessee, because when he played, the team was a lot better. He made everybody around him better because of his presence, but he just wasn't worth the $20 million he was being paid. I always use the example, hey, a garnish, you throw a little bit of parsley on top of a baked potato or some chives or something like that. You throw a little bit of thyme on a well-cooked steak. It is going to elevate that meal, not only in presentation, but in taste. But you don't pay as much for the garnish as you do the meat. And Bud Dupree is garnish. So I wanted to take a moment and mention that his impact on a defense can be substantial, but I really like what he can do in run defense when healthy too, even though we've spent a lot of the time talking about pass rush.
No, I get that. Yeah. He's a cog in the machine on a good defense.
Yes.
But he's not going to be the thing that makes that good defense go, right?
Yeah, he's not the engine, but he can be I don't know enough about cars to continue the metaphor, but somebody does out there, and they're saying it right now.
Yeah, I dug myself too deep. But Tyler, let the listeners know what you guys got going on in Locked On Titans. I've heard a couple of your episodes the last couple of weeks, and it's all about, who the Titans are going to trade up for, right? That seems to be the big conversation.
That is like the hottest topic, I guess, like the spiciest topic. But actually right now I'm smack dab in the middle of the Locked On Titans 2023 NFL draft preview. If you're a Falcons fan, I know you're covering a ton of draft stuff. You're excellent with your coverage of the draft and prospects, but I go over like 150 to 180 prospects, strengths, weaknesses, where they should be drafted, how they fit within a scheme. And since there's some scheme familiarity, maybe that's something that Locked On Falcons fans would be interested in. But of course, Locked On Titans, Monday through Friday, free on all platforms. I write over for Sports Illustrated at alltitans.com. And you can find my hot takes and my musings on Twitter at Tic Tac Titans, of course.
Yeah, well, you're covering a lot more prospects than I'm covering here on Locked On Falcons. So I
too many.
To go check that out if they're, they're just not getting enough prospect talk here on Locked On Falcons. Locked On Titans has you covered for that. And Tyler, since you're here, we always have to leave with you. A dirty bird. So let's get it going. There you go.
Oh, yes. Oh, I didn't want to leave without it. I'm so happy we checked.
This is why you should be the co-host. I might have to cut you a check very shortly for the dirty bird. So want to thank Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans once again for joining me, as he has so often done these past couple of off seasons, in order to break down a current Falcon, a former Tennessee Titans, and on Bud Dupree. I've never been a huge fan of Bud Dupree, even going back to his days at Kentucky. Not a fan of him in Pittsburgh, not a fan in Tennessee, and so to me, this is an interesting move for the Falcons. The Okudah trade as well as the Dupree signing, to me, gives the team options at edge and corner if the draft doesn't go the way. And we're talking a little bit about maybe the draft doesn't go that way because we don't have as many quarterbacks going at the top of the draft. And that's part of the reason why we're talking about this, because it's like, what do the Falcons know something that the rest of us don't know? That's why they're getting the edge in the corner, because they have a suspicion that they won't be able to get those guys at the top of the draft like we have been assuming for months and months and months. But my general opinion of Bud Dupree is he's kind of a slightly better version of Lorenzo Carter. Like if Lorenzo Carter was less effective dropping into coverage and was a more stout run defender, that's basically what Bud Dupree is. And I think the upside of this move is similar to the conversation we had when we signed Calais Campbell. It's not that you're getting this dominant pass rusher. I don't expect Bud Dupree, as part of the Falcons rotation to get, 8 to 10 sacks and have this bounce back year like Tyler was talking about a couple of years ago in his final years in Pittsburgh. He's probably going to be like a 3 to 4 or 5 sack guy. But as we talked about with that, the Calais Campbell signing, it's really about getting a bunch of guys that can get you, 4 or 5 or more sacks. And I think it elevates the floor for this Falcons pass rush and puts them on the path to being, getting 40 plus sacks for the first time in almost 2 decades. So I'm not mad at the move. I'm just going to let you know up front that I am not the world's biggest fan of Bud Dupree, and it's not going to be somebody that you're probably going to hear me spend a lot of time talking about. Oh man, Bud Dupree's going to be this, impact player for the Atlanta Falcons. So I just want to give you a heads up. Now, obviously, when we get to the actual performances on the field in August, September, etc., I am more than willing to, praise players that play well if they exceed my expectations. The people that are longtime listeners know that I'm not just going to be a stubborn, hater unless your name is Mohamed Sanu. But anyway, so I think we'll see how that goes. And I think the key with the Bud Dupree signing is going to be what the terms of the contract is. It's up to $5 million. We don't know exactly what that means. And the thing we'll have to pay a lot of attention to is the guaranteed money. Because let's just say the Falcons signed him to a contract similar to what the Cowboys gave Dante Fowler this offseason, which was like a 1 year, $3 million deal, but it only had $1 million guaranteed. And Dallas and presumably the Falcons in this case, if it applies to Bud Dupree, that doesn't guarantee that player a spot on the roster. That means that the player could wind up getting cut, especially if the Falcons go out there and draft a player early in this draft and they're like, well, Tyree Wilson or let's say Miles Murphy gives us exactly what we're hoping to get from Bud Dupree, so we don't really need Bud Dupree in this regard. And you compare that to a player like Lorenzo Carter, where the Falcons gave him a 2-year contract, but $5 million of that is guaranteed. So Lorenzo Carter is basically a lock to make the Falcons roster this year, unless the Falcons can drum up some trade interest or something like that in August. But they're not going to cut him, is basically what I'm going to say, because his contract really prohibits them from cutting him. And so I'll be curious to see what exactly the terms are for Bud Dupree's contract, and we'll just have to wait and see. But it is curious to me that the Falcons are being very proactive addressing, holes at corner and edge over the last week, and we have not seen the team show that proactivity at the line, at the left guard position, at the offensive line position, right? And maybe that's something that we can potentially explore on tomorrow's episode. Does it mean that the Falcons are setting themselves up for drafting a player like Peter Skoronski, the Northwestern offensive tackle / guard? And maybe we need to revisit. We talked about Skoronski earlier this offseason, and I was kind of like, yeah, I don't think he's going to be on the Falcons radar. And now it's like, well, maybe he is back. And certainly in a world where the Falcons can't find that trade partner and move back at the draft, and they're stuck, and they don't want to take a defensive player, or those guys are off the board. They don't want to take a running back like Bijan Robinson. Let's explore the possibility of Peter Skoronski. So that's something to check out on Locked On Falcons as the rest of the week unfolds. So continue to make us your first listen, guys, and continue to check us out every single day so that I can give you guys a shout out on each episode and telling you how, this humble, illustrious podcast is your first listen each and every day. So that is what's in store. We spent a lot of time talking about who the Falcons are going to take in round 1. We also have some guests coming up this week that will talk about the possibilities on day 2 and day 3 of this draft, since we don't spend nearly enough time talking about those players. So that will be something also that you can look in store for as you make Locked On Falcons your first listen, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.